I want to welcome and thank all of you that are joining us today. We are continuing with our COVID-19 legal issues series. COVID-19 continues to change our world and how we live in it. Back in the spring, when we were first beginning to understand what COVID-19 was, we had no idea we would still be feeling its impact 8 months later. Now, with elections just days away, the pandemic threatens our ability to vote. Today, we are joined by two alumni to talk about the pandemic's impact on our lives. Joining us today are Paul Hancock. He's a partner at K&L Gates in Miami, Florida, and Steve Hartman, who's a partner at Spengler Nathanson in Toledo, Ohio. My name is Heather Carnes. Dean Barros and I will be co-moderating today. And so I would like to begin by asking our panelists to talk a little bit about their careers. Hello, panelists. Paul, I'd like to start with you. If you could just share with us a little bit about your career path. We tend to have students and young alums on the call, and so it's always interesting for them to hear how alumni get to the point that they are today. So if you could just talk a little about that for a minute.
Yeah, and it's an interesting course that in my case was never really planned. I left law school in 1970 and went to work for the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. I thought I would be there a couple of years and come back to Toledo, but it turned out I stayed 27 years, a large variety of different types of civil rights cases. For 10 years of that, can you hear me? Okay. I was going to say, for 10 years of that, I managed the department's litigation program under the Voting Rights Act. So that gave me a in voting rights law, both in litigation, and another one of our major responsibilities at the time was to send federal observers in to observe the conduct of elections in states and localities around the country to make sure they were racially fair. I left the department then in 1997 to go to Florida, where I became the Deputy Attorney General for the state of Florida. And in the first presidential election after I came to Florida was the 2000 election, which we had the great controversy that led to the Bush v. Gore case. Because of my background in voting, the Attorney General asked me to be his chief lawyer in defending him in the lawsuit. And that lawsuit started. The supervisor of elections in Palm Beach County sent a request for an opinion to both the Secretary of State of Florida in general about whether the fact that the machines weren't properly reading ballots was a ground for a recount. And she got conflicting opinions from the Attorney General and the Secretary of State, and therefore filed an original action in the Florida Supreme Court to ask the court to say what should be done. And I represented the Attorney General in that lawsuit. And after this Florida Supreme Court's decision, the Supreme Court granted certiorari to review the case, and I represented the Attorney General before the Supreme Court. So it was a great fight. It was a very controversial time, but it deja vu. That was 20 years ago, and now we're hearing about other problems that are coming up 20 years later. So that's my path.
That's your path, right?
Yeah.
And have you been involved in additional election-related law and litigation since?
No, I have not been. It hasn't been part of my legal practice, my private legal practice. Civil rights has, so civil rights in general has. Mm-hmm. As this election has approached, I've gotten a number of calls from different parties and some people who want to try and talk about what happened in 2000 and how it compares to what's happening today. I'm not currently representing anyone in any election issue.
Got it. Well, that's what we did. So I certainly appreciate it.
Yeah.
Steve, what about you?
I started in private practice with a small firm out of law school. Actually, while I was in law school, I started working for them. Stayed there about 15 years, became a partner, and then decided I wanted to hang out my own shingle for a while. So I did that for a couple of years. And when I got a call from a friend who was at Spangler, and they asked for a conversation, and it seemed like a good fit. So here I am. Been here going on 2 years now, and it's great. I love it. My practice focuses on civil litigation. I do all different types of civil litigation on the plaintiff and the defense side. And I do quite a bit of criminal defense. Most of that is federal. And I've done some election law over the years. I've worked for campaigns both pre and post election, advising and strategizing and making sure that they comply with the laws that they're required to comply with. I have represented campaigns in recounts and election contests, and a mandamus action before the Ohio Supreme Court to get a judicial candidate on the ballot. And I also work with a group called Ohio Promote the Vote, which is the Ohio Democratic Party's effort to monitor the polls, make sure every eligible voter gets to vote and every vote is counted. And I've been doing that for about five election cycles.
Sorry, to make sure I'm not muted also. So both of you bring a wealth of experience to this conversation today. What are the things that are at top of mind for each of you as we enter the next handful of days toward the election? What are the things that you're thinking about? Steve, we'll pick on you first.
Well, I'm primarily thinking about what problems could arise on election day at the polls, and how we deal with those. Working closely with the Board of Elections to try to troubleshoot issues that we can troubleshoot in advance. There are issues about students voting, about quarantine people voting, about sick people voting. It really runs the gamut. So that's what I'll be thinking about, and also looking out for voter intimidation and voter suppression efforts, and hope there aren't any of those.
Okay. Paul, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I should add, I left off my background when I was with the Attorney General's office, but I left that in 2003 and have been in private practice with K&L Gates, national, international law firms since that time. I still do a lot of rights type work, but I haven't done much voting rights work. It's not, it hasn't been a major part of my practice. I just want to see a fair election, a good election. I hope it's not close. One way, because that's where the issues arise when the election is close. And the Florida controversy in 2000, didn't present issues that were new or unique. What was unique about that was the election was virtually a tie. So the issues that frequently arise in election could have affected the outcome of the election in that circumstance. So I think it's better for all of us if it's not close enough that the little problems that might arise, are not outcome determinative. But I followed with interest. I like to watch this stuff. I'm a geek on it. I like to watch what's happening. I try to keep up with what the courts are doing, what kind of issues the courts are encountering with this election. There's already been several emergency motions before the Supreme Court in connection with this election. We have obviously brand new issues. I mean, there's been a long trend for increased emphasis on early voting and on voting by mail, and that has really accelerated because of this pandemic. So the states are really overburdened with these kind of issues, and it's just presenting a lot of new challenges that they're not maybe really new, but are really exacerbated from the level that they were before.
If I could ask a follow-up question, one thing you mentioned, Paul, is that one thing that I follow elections pretty closely, and I've been reading about a little bit and thinking about, is that in every election, there are problems. In every election, there are ballots that are tossed for technical reasons.
Right.
It's only an issue if it's close. And it seems like one of the things the pandemic is doing is it's creating strain, it's creating problems, it's creating adjustments, which leads to legal issues. Right now, all the campaigns on both sides are posturing and trying to, get things argue for what they think will best benefit their party. But none of it matters if it's not close. And if it's close, it can turn into a train wreck. Fair statement. And so maybe you could just, both of you could just educate people a little bit on some of the things that routinely go wrong, right? Why in a typical election, ballots might get tossed for signature requirements or something like that. That in a complicated process like this, it's fairly routine that we have problems. So what are those kind of problems that are fairly common?
Well, I can start. I mean, obviously, there's problems with voters not being on the list of eligible voters. You get the question of who can vote, who can't vote. Then you get the question of they're not on the eligible list of eligible voters, can they cast a provisional ballot, and how should that be counted? When is provisional ballot counted? When isn't it counted? As you said, Dean, obviously with the absentee votes, you've got signature issues. You've got with mail-in votes, you've got issues about when they were sent and when they should be counted. Most state, and that's a big issue in this election because of the extent of mail-in ballots. A number of states have wanted to extend the deadlines for receipt of ballots. So those are issues of what votes should be counted. And I think those are the kind of issues that normally arise, but you are entirely correct to say they are meaningless unless they, well, I mean, obviously every vote is sacrosanct, everybody's vote should be counted. But as far as whether it affects the outcome of the election, that is really the key issue. And it's more, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is a presidential election, which there has to be an end to for timing. The votes have to be counted in January, and then we have to elect a president in January. So any other election, their challenges can drag on for extended periods of time, a year or two, in which the candidate who won can be replaced if the party prevails. That can't be done in a presidential election. That's what happened with Bush v. Gore in 2000, when the recount was underway and the Supreme Court finally said, this is really just messed up. It's not being done the same way in one county as in another county. Equal protection is being violated here. So we have to stop this recount and get on with naming a president. And one could argue that they locked in place an equal protection violation because some people's votes weren't being counted because the recount was stopped. But I think the point was that at that point, we had to get on with deciding who's going to be president. And that's what makes a presidential election really unique. And we also have, concern, it's exacerbated here because we have a tight timetable now to deal with issues that might come up.
Steve, any thoughts about just kind of some of the routine things that can go wrong in a given election?
Yeah, in a given election, Paul's exactly right. Most of these things don't matter unless it's a very close election. But, some of the things are exacerbated in this election, such as the counting of mail-in absentee ballots. In Ohio, the boards of elections have 10 days after the election to receive absentee ballots in the mail. And as long as they were postmarked by the date of the election, they'll count. Now, some states, they have to be received by election day. And there's a lot of concern about the Postal Service handling the volume of absentee ballots that are being requested. And that volume is largely thought to be because of the pandemic, because people would rather vote by mail than vote in person. So those are issues. Provisional ballots, don't get counted till after the election. And in Ohio, there are the so-called 5 fields. There are 5 pieces of information that you have to put on your identification envelope in which you put the provisional ballot. And if those 5 fields aren't filled out correctly, your ballot's not going to count unless the Board of Elections can track you down and you can get that fixed, or bring your ID in after the election within that 10-day window. So if it's close, those things are going to matter a lot.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I agree completely with what Steve says there. And the time for receipt of mail-in ballots is an important issue and will be an important issue in this election for the reasons that Steve said. And also adding on to that, a lot of states now have, like Ohio does, a provision that you can, ballots will be received up to 10 days after the election, so long as they are postmarked by the time of the election. But a lot of times the Postal Service doesn't postmark envelopes now. So the question is, if ballots come in 9 days after the election without a postmark, what should you do? Should you count it, or you count it? I mean, I have a long background in this issue because when I was doing voting rights litigation for the Justice Department, we brought some of the early cases under what was then called the the Military and Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act, in which provided that was designed to ensure the protection of the right to vote for men and women in the military primarily, but also for citizens overseas. And we faced a lot of problems in those early years, in the early 80s, for example, that some states had very close schedules for elections where runoff primaries were very close to the general election. And that a lot of times they were delayed in getting ballots out in time to the military that they could be received back in the hands of the election officials by the time the polls closed on election day. And we, in the Department of Justice at the time, were able to negotiate settlements in those cases, including with states like Florida. Florida has a provision that ballots have to be received by the election officials by the time the polls close on election day. And we were able to get a consent order that required that they would be counted so long as they were postmarked by the time the polls closed on election day and received within 10 days after the close of the polls. That became an issue of controversy in the Bush v. Gore case because, again, with the election very close, some people were realizing for the first time that all votes weren't going to be in on election day, that within 10 days we're going to continue to receive ballots. We resolved that by agreeing that those votes would be counted, even if the postmark wasn't legible, because you had to lean over backwards to allow men and women in the military to vote. So Florida counted all those ballots that were being received. But now, we're seeing more and more of that, and we're seeing a lot of the litigation that has been filed this year has been, when should you count those votes and when shouldn't you? And can courts themselves extend the deadline for receipt of ballots? In other words, even if the legislature does it, can the courts extend them? And in a state like Wisconsin, it was decided they can't. In a state like Pennsylvania, it was decided that they can. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court said time for receipt of ballot can be extended. That was only for 3 days. But the Pennsylvania Supreme Court also said that if there's not a postmark, it should be presumed to be timely cast unless there's proof that it isn't. And those are the kind of issues that now there's an emergency request for orders from the Supreme Court to stay those orders. The Supreme Court let stand the Pennsylvania order, but it was an 8-member court at the time, and it was a 4-4 vote, or 5-3, I guess it was, with Justice Roberts siding with the liberals. But now we have a 9-member court. There's some effort in Pennsylvania to get that issue back before the Supreme Court, and there's continued fights in states like Wisconsin as to how long can we delay this and count votes. And I guess one other point on that is that in some states like Florida, mail-in ballots are being counted as they're received. In other states, like I believe Wisconsin, and I don't know about Michigan, perhaps Steve knows more about Michigan than I do, they're not being counted until the election day. So they're going to be really behind on counting votes if they're not starting. Florida's starting the process. So in that respect, they'll be ahead of the game. But other states are not even starting the process of counting votes until election day.
Until election day happens, then they start the counting.
Right. That's what Ohio is, Michigan too?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Right.
So I'm curious, Steve, you in Ohio, so I voted absentee for the first time in my life, or vote, because I usually vote in person because of COVID. And I've been able to check on the Lucas County website that my ballot has been received and is categorized as countable, right? Can you tell us a little bit about the process? My understanding is that given that they can, and this is where it's different in Pennsylvania, they can't even open the ballots until election day. But in Ohio, even if they don't start counting until election day, if they have everything orderly and ready to go, are they going to be able to move pretty quickly? Or is there a potential for a real delay here?
No, the Board of Elections says that they'll be ready to go and move quickly because they'll have everything organized. And they do classify the ballots as countable or not countable. That's more in the case of if it comes in late or if it hasn't been processed yet, then it'll be, it won't show up as countable. But that really, again, is only an issue if it's close, and the Board of Elections says that they're going to be ready to go and they'll get the absentee results out before the rest of the results start being publicized. So that'll be the first set of results that are released will be those absentee votes. Not only the mail-in, but from the early vote center as well.
Okay. And so how do, just as a nitty-gritty thing, so I've also noticed there are lines around the early voting. Are those the same type of ballots as people are voting on if they vote in person on election day? But how does this work logistically? Say I went down and I voted in person at early voting. How does that move through the process?
Well, the way it works is you check in and you don't actually have to provide an ID if you're voting early. The rules are different for early voting and election day, which is a little strange, but it's because it's absentee balloting. But you vote on a machine, on a DRE machine, just like you would on election day. And your paper ballot, which is printed out after you record all your votes, that's the official record of the election. But the vote count is kept on memory cards. So those memory cards are kept and stored, and they can be read very quickly once election day comes. That's how they get caught up so quickly on those early vote center votes.
Great, thanks. So how do we live in this world, in our country here, our great country, the United States of America, 50 plus jurisdictions here, where for federal elections, every state has its own rules? How did we get here? And because there are a couple issues that I'd like to talk about with you. One is the federalism issues. There's also, and Paul, you already started to talk about this a little bit, there's the court versus the legislature, right? And so state courts, there's an interesting question about whether state courts can change rules. State legislatures can, but can state courts? And can the federal courts change the state rules? But could the federal government pass a law that made voting in federal elections uniform throughout the country? Is that possible? You know?
Well, they have. They have. I mean, they set the terms and conditions of voting in federal elections. States can can set their own terms and conditions for voting in state elections. They have to comply with law to the extent they're federal elections. But traditionally in the country, states have determined the method of conducting elections, and the laws vary from state to state. And I guess that's just a system of federalism. The states can do it so long as they're not. And I can give you one example, even dating back to the early passage of the Voting Rights Act. At the time of the adoption of the 24th Amendment, which eliminated poll taxes, the 24th Amendment eliminated the poll tax or any other tax as a precondition to voting in federal elections. But that didn't mean that states couldn't use a poll tax for voting in state elections. And some states actually proposed to continue to use a poll tax to vote in state elections. And that all happened. The 24th Amendment was completed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. The Voting Rights Act itself had an unusual provision in it that directed the Attorney General of the United States to bring legal actions against states that were continuing to use a poll tax. So it was outlawed by the 24th Amendment. So you wondered, well, how could anybody continue to use it if it's outlawed by the 24th Amendment? Well, the answer is it wasn't outlawed for state elections. So the Voting Rights Act had this very unusual provision that directed the Attorney General to bring lawsuits. And the Attorney General brought actions shortly after the Voting Rights Act was passed to eliminate the poll tax in Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, I forget the other state, Alabama, I guess it was, and courts entered injunctions that prohibited the use of the poll tax. But that showed how states could still have authority to manage their own elections, and they still do today. And we have different laws about how long ballots can be counted, how you vote, whether you have early voting, to the extent you have early voting. That's just our system, I guess. But yeah, I mean, Congress could change that as it wants. I have pretty broad authority for adopting uniform provisions for federal elections.
Thanks. So how about this issue of the role of state legislatures and the ability of courts, both state and federal, to change things in an emergency, right? This gets back to the COVID theme here. We're in a really unusual circumstance. And so because of a pandemic, a lot of people want to vote in a different way than they traditionally have. And there are questions about whether under these emergency circumstances, we should make changes. So I believe, generally the case, a state legislature can make a change. If the state legislature does not, there's this question about what can the courts do? And there may be a difference. I think Chief Justice Roberts seems to be suggesting that there's a difference between what state courts can do and what federal courts can do. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. Maybe, Steve, we can start with you and then go to Paul on that.
Sure. The roles of the courts, they do vary. I wouldn't be surprised. I'll just give you an example. They say 71 million people have voted already in this election. And so there's some question, is election day going to be light, or is this just going to be record turnout that we're having? And most people think election day is going to be very heavy. And because of the COVID-19 provisions that are put in place by boards of elections and secretaries of state, it takes a little longer to process the voters and get them through that line. They do a good job. I've been observing here in Lucas County, and the long lines aren't because they're not doing their job. I can tell you that. They're getting them through pretty quickly, but I wouldn't be surprised if those long lines lead to some kind of litigation on election day seeking injunctive relief to keep a poll open. And that could be done in a state or federal court, I believe. because you're not talking about, a specific, it can be enforcing a state or a federal right. Other than that, I think it depends on whether you're talking about an issue of state law or federal law dictates what court you're in, just like any other suit.
Paul?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty clear, as you say, Ben, that the Supreme Court will largely defer to actions of state legislatures, what they think best, and they can change their laws as they think best. I think it's more of a stretch when a state court does it, changes an election provision. And there's a principle that has guided federal courts for a long time, that courts should not enter orders that interfere with the election process shortly before the election. They should try and stay out of it. Now, that's kind of a principle that is talked about all the time. How it's used in practice, it's going to be challenged here, but I think that's going to be something that, at least in the background, is guiding the courts. I mean, the courts certainly didn't hold back in 2000 from getting involved, but I think that general concept is one that they're cautious about getting involved in changing election procedures, endorsing a change of election procedures shortly before the election.
Right. And I was trying to remember what the name of that case is. I don't know if that principle that they refer to quite a bit. Paul, you're muted.
Yeah. Either I keep going on mute. I can't think of the name either.
There you go.
Yeah, but I think it'll come to me as we talk.
Yeah. Okay. So Heather, I want to turn it over to you. Do you have questions, or do you have audience questions you'd like to ask? I'm happy to keep going, but I'll go on mute for a minute.
I do have audience questions, but first I just want to ask a general question of the two of you, Steve and Paul. So we've been talking about just the litigation side of it, but what's your sense of voters and the voter responsibility? Do you feel like people are excited? Are they anxious? Is this a time that people are kind of excited about their responsibility, or is the pandemic and is the pandemic overshadowing everything in a negative way? Steve, we'll start with you.
Yeah, perhaps unfortunately, Heather, I think the answer to that question is yes. I think it's all of the above to a certain extent. People are very excited. People are taking the responsibility and the right to vote very seriously. That's probably in part because the nation is so divided right now, more than any time in my lifetime, for sure. It is. And people are excited to go exercise that right because they want to support the ideas that they have about the direction the country should take. And I think that's why we're seeing the turnout we're seeing, despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. I think that's the amazing thing that we need to be mindful of, is the number of absentee ballots that are coming in and the number of people who are voting in person early is just higher than ever before, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. And I think that's just amazing. And I think it's a sign of a good, healthy democracy, frankly.
Good point. I'm glad to hear that. Go ahead, Paul.
No, I don't have anything to add. You're spot on with it. That's right.
Okay. Let me see. A question that came in is just somebody commenting on voters going to the wrong location. I don't know if that's, I think people are trying to figure out a lot of those logistical issues ahead of time. I don't know if the two of you feel differently, but I feel like people are much more informed right now, and they're doing what they can to figure things out. Are you seeing or hearing anything different?
Yeah, I think people are well informed, but it happens every election cycle that people do go to the wrong precinct. And what happens in that instance is their vote just simply isn't going to count. The law says it's the responsibility of the precinct election official to direct that person to the right polling location and the correct precinct therein. But if the person absolutely insists on voting in the wrong location, their vote's just not going to count in Ohio. And I would imagine it's like that in most states. It's different if they vote in the wrong precinct, but the right polling location. That's different. Those votes can be counted, but if they vote in the wrong polling location, no, that just won't be counted.
Okay. Can they be directed elsewhere? I mean, they should
Yes.
be directed elsewhere.
They're supposed to be directed elsewhere if they're in the wrong polling location, sure. And you have issues in part because of the pandemic. There's been consolidation of polling locations because of everything from shortage of election workers to shortages of PPE. You've had states that have had to, and boards of elections that have had to expand their polling locations in size, but diminish them in number. So some people's polling locations are going to change for this election day. And people need to be aware of that and look in advance. You can go to the Board of Elections website, or in Ohio, you can go to the Secretary of State's website and find out exactly where you're supposed to vote.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, that certainly has been an issue in a lot of elections of people going to the wrong polling place. And I mean, there's some logic to the requirement. I mean, if you don't live in the city, you shouldn't vote at the city polling place where the ballot has the office of mayor on it. So you got to give people the right ballot, and the right ballot depends on where they live and what their polling place is. I think I've thought that, and I don't know about Ohio, so I defer to Steve on this, but in a lot of states, it's not really an issue with early voting because there's a limited number of early voting sites and people just get the ballot according to where they live. But election day, it's more important, and it's an issue of controversy over the years. We dealt with it a lot at the Department of Justice, and the Justice Department was very insistent on making sure that states carried out their responsibility. If people came to the wrong polling place, tell them where they should go so that they can go and cast a ballot. If they insist, then that's a use of a provisional ballot, but again, it might not be counted if they're just in the wrong place and get the wrong ballot.
Yeah. Okay.
And they also have the option to get a presidential ballot, in which they can vote just for the office of president and vice president and federal offices.
Okay. Great. Let's see. I'm looking for other questions. Ben, feel free to jump in while I'm taking a look at these.
Let's say, can we just go back to, we haven't actually talked about Bush v. Gore in that much depth, because it's really interesting that was our last big election law controversy. And so, Paul, you litigated that, including in the Supreme Court of the United States. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that process? And it's always interesting to me to hear from people who've argued in front of the Supreme Court, and what that experience was like, just to give everybody a little bit of a sense of the history there.
It obviously was a remarkable experience, and I'm not a Supreme Court practitioner. I do have a background in voting rights, which I'm comfortable with. And I was pretty comfortable arguing before the Florida Supreme Court because I viewed the issue as somewhat like my own experience of being a voting rights lawyer. The question was, should we count people's votes, or if we can somehow look to see if we can determine their intent? And I thought that sure, we should do everything we can to count people's votes. Then when the Supreme Court took certiorari, that Florida Supreme Court decision was about Thanksgiving time. The Supreme Court accepted certiorari and had a very expedited briefing schedule, such that the and set the argument for December 1st of 2000. So that's a very short time between the decision of the Florida Supreme Court. So they didn't have the time to consider, receive and consider all the briefing about the issue, which they normally had. And when I was, I initially didn't want to argue that case. I thought the Florida Attorney General should hire a Supreme Court practitioner to argue that. And he asked me to see who I would recommend. And when I called around the country to people I knew, and the guiding light to me on that turned out to be Drew Days, who was the former Solicitor General of the United States, a longtime professor at Yale Law School. And I talked to Drew about it, who I knew because he had headed the Civil Rights Division earlier in my career in the Civil Rights Division. And Drew said to me, he said, Paul, anybody who calls is going to say they're the best person to argue this case before the U.S. Supreme Court. He said, but what I think the Supreme Court needs is somebody who knows what's going on the ground in Florida. They don't need anyone to tell them what the Constitution means. They know what the Constitution means. What they don't know is what's going on on the ground in the state of Florida. And he said, so I really think you should do it yourself. You should argue this case yourself. That was a very unusual response, I thought, and I thought it was unusual for me to be the one to argue that case. But the Attorney General of Florida, Bob Butterworth, who's, Bob is a very strong state right advocate. He doesn't want to have lawyers outside of his office arguing cases if lawyers in his office can argue cases. So that really is the background of why I argued that before the U.S. Supreme Court. And I should say that adding on to this, since that 20 years, kind of the issues in elections have changed. And, Steve talks about his group monitoring elections. There's all kind of groups now monitoring elections. Sometimes at elections, we have more observers than we have voters at the polling places, which I think makes it even more challenging for election officials. And the issues have changed. And, in some of the subsequent elections, major issues have, while groups wanting fair elections have really focused on monitoring what goes on at the polling place. And I think that's very valuable. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what's going on in polling places now, because it's showing new issues coming up. But some of the issues that have been most important over the years since then have not occurred at the polling places. They've occurred before the election, such as in 2000, one good example of that was the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County, which was a very confusing ballot, and people just didn't know how to vote it. They just made mistakes and didn't cast votes for president because they didn't know how to do it. And even more recently, in the 2016 election for Senate, which was a very contentious election in Florida between Bill Nelson, who was the Democratic incumbent senator at the time, and our current senator, who was a former governor, and I can't think of his name right now, and I should know it so well. But in that case, the ballot layout in Broward County was such that it had the instructions on the left-hand side, and the instructions were translated into several different languages. Then at the bottom of the page, there was the vote for Senate. And many, many people missed that. They didn't see the vote because the layout was very confusing. And that was really an avoidable mistake. Candidates themselves have an opportunity to view ballot layouts before an election. That should have been caught. It wasn't caught. It might have cost Bill Nelson the election because it was a close contest and very many people didn't vote that. Now, did they just not want to vote it, or did they just not see it on the ballot? So those are the kind of issues that have happened in elections since 2000. And we're, again, facing new issues, I think, now that we haven't seen before.
So I'm curious, maybe I'd like to ask you two questions. One is, what issues do you think are going to be, predicting the future is a sucker's game, I know that, right? But what issues do you see being contentious in the next week? And the second one I'd like you to think about, maybe we can take them in turn, is say you were the emperor of U.S. elections, right? You had total control over how elections were conducted, at least for federal elections in the United States. What changes would you make in our system to try to avoid some of these issues that we keep coming up? So, Steve, can we start with you just as far as what crystal ball? What do you think we're going to be reading about next Wednesday?
Well, I think we're probably going to be reading about the fact that we don't know who won yet.
Yep.
And that's going to lead us to be reading about the counting of mail-in ballots and the legitimacy of the issues with the post office that we talked about earlier, and what constitutes a valid ballot and what doesn't. I think that's something that we're going to be reading about to some extent. I mean, I hope we don't get me wrong, but I think we might, if I had a crystal ball that I was looking at. If I was the emperor of elections, I would probably want to see more uniformity in federal elections throughout the states. And I know we talked about the fact that the operation of elections has largely been left to the province of the states. But I would like to see more uniformity in how we run federal elections, so we don't have these state-specific issues that, like we did in 2000, that can decide the election for one state over 49 others and the territories. So I guess that's what I'd like to see if I were in charge. There's probably a longer list of things I could come up with if I put pen to paper, but that's what immediately comes to mind.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to hear arguments about easy requirements for registration. There's a lot of people believe voters should be automatically registered when they turn 18 and shouldn't have to do much at all to register. An issue of great controversy in Florida this year is whether felons who have completed their term of sentence should have their voting rights restored. There was a referendum in 2018 that restored the rights of felons to vote when they complete the terms and conditions of their sentence. But the Florida legislature interpreted that in a law it passed overwhelmingly in a citizen referendum. And the Florida legislature, however, which is primarily Republican, passed a law that provided that completing the terms and conditions of your sentence means you've had to pay all your fines and fees that were assessed against you. If you haven't, you weren't eligible to have your voting rights restored. That was challenged in a number of lawsuits. Recently, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, sitting en banc, overturned a district court decision that had granted the right to vote to felons if they could not afford to pay their fines. So if they could afford it, they had to pay it, but if they couldn't afford it, they shouldn't be denied the right to vote. Again, the en banc 11th Circuit decided to overturn that decision, so that will prevent a large number of people in Florida who were convicted of felony from voting even when they completed their sentence. I mentioned the party affiliation on this because again, the government, the legislature is heavily Republican, controlled by Republicans. It is expected that if felons or former felons are permitted to vote, that will favor Democrats at the polls. A largely disproportionate number of felons in Florida are Black, and Blacks are more likely to register to vote as Democrats. So there's obviously a political overtone to that. I mean, I think that will continue to be fought out as we go forward. And there's always been this, there's been for decades now this tension between Democrats and Republicans over ease of voting, which Democrats want, with protecting the integrity of the electoral process, which Republicans advocate. And it shows up in issues like voter ID laws. A number of states have passed laws requiring IDs when you appear at the polling place. And also purging of voting rolls. The Help America Vote Act, or the motor voter law that Congress passed decades ago, eased registration so that you could register when you got your driver's license. But it also was kind of a compromise where it had provisions where states could regularly purge rolls to make sure that only people who are eligible to vote cast ballots. I don't think that fight is over. We'll continue to see that fought out in the coming years.
Yeah, we had a question from the audience just asking the 11th Circuit, on what basis did the 11th Circuit decide that? And, you know, it's actually interesting. I remember I skimmed through that case and there were multiple opinions. But do you recall off the top of your head why the 11th Circuit reversed the district court on that?
Well, they said because the referendum itself said you had to complete all terms and conditions of your sentence, and that legislature, the court said, properly interpret that to mean fines and fees. There was a major issue in that, in which I actually weighed in on, as we filed an amicus brief on behalf of former officials of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. 36 of us filed a brief as amicus in which we argued that the state was just imposing a poll tax by requiring people to pay a fine. The 24th Amendment, again, as I said earlier, says you can't require a poll tax or any other fine as a precondition to voting. Our view was that constituted a fine. The money was designed to support state government, which had all the earmarkings of a fine. And we also even relied on the Supreme Court decision upholding the Obamacare law, in that it said you've got to look at whether something is a tax by looking at its functional purpose. And in that case, as you know, the Supreme Court decision upheld the Obama law as primarily regulate a tax, and the Congress had authority to enact the tax. But the 11th Circuit disagreed with us and said it wasn't a poll tax. So that was the basis for the decision. And
didn't a couple of the judges concur and seem to suggest even what was a poll tax, that would be okay? I seem to recall that.
Yeah, there were arguments. There were arguments being made that since felons didn't have the right to vote, for some reason you could, and I'm being more partisan now than I have tried to be in this conversation, but I was involved in this case. I'm giving you my view rather than my detached analysis of it. You know, there was some argument being made that since felons didn't have the right to vote, that in restoring the right to vote, you could limit the right to vote. But I think that argument seems to suggest you could say that white felons could vote, but black felons couldn't, because the argument was other provisions of the Constitution didn't apply. But I mean, I think you can make good arguments as to whether or not it's a poll tax or isn't a poll tax. But I think that's an issue that's going to continue to be an issue of great controversy as we go forward. In the Supreme Court, you review that decision. I mean, that decision might go before the Supreme Court as well.
Okay. All right, Heather, we're getting towards the top of the hour, so let me turn it over to you to wrap it up.
All right. So I want to ask Paul and Steve if you have any final words as we close out. Any last comments for our listeners and for anyone that may hear the recording in the next few days? Steve, we'll start with you. But first, I have to unmute you. There you go.
I think everybody who's tuned into this has probably voted already or has their plan to do so, and that's the message that I'm trying to get out. You know, that's what I post once every 4 years. I post on social media. It's to tell people to get out and vote. So I would just remind everybody not to forget that, because it is so important.
Fantastic. Paul, any last words?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I would also say that let election officials do their job. You know, this is such a polarized election. We have so many interested parties. We have so many people at the polling places looking for problems. And unfortunately, I'm receiving reports of conduct that might constitute voter intimidation at the polls. You know, I just hope that doesn't continue. You know, our election officials are dedicated people. They want to do the right thing, and it's hard sometimes to decide what the right thing is. I mean, I'm hearing reports about if people come to the polling place and aren't wearing masks, should they be prevented from voting because they aren't wearing a mask? How do we deal with those issues? Those are, there's difficult issues that election officials are going to have to decide here, but we really need to let them do their job, and hopefully we'll have a fair election, and again, an election that is not close, however, whoever wins.
Absolutely. As we wrap up, I wanted to share also, we have a constitutional law professor here, Professor Rebecca Zitlow, and she has been doing a number of spots. And she talks about just trusting the process and recognizing that there is a system in place. And Paul, like you said, let people do their jobs, let the work get done. And Steve, echoing your point, just get out and vote. So I just want to thank everyone for participating, for joining us for this. Dean Barros for co-moderating, and Paul and Steve, it occurs to me we should catch up with you in about a week or so to see how things are going on your end. But in the meantime, we will let you go, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you, Heather and Dean and Steve. I enjoyed this very much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us
today.
Thanks,
guys.
Yeah,
Talk to
take
you
care,
later.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.